So this course is actually on Wonhyo and Korean Buddhism. I have a very elaborate title for the course. It is called Wonhyo's Ecumenical Philosophy, kind of 화쟁사상, ecumenical philosophy, and Korean Buddhism in an age of globalization. This is a title that was given to me by Dongguk to do. So I'll do this, but in my own way. When we talk about globalization, what I'm going to mean is simply looking at Korean Buddhism from a very broad regional perspective. So not just looking at Korean Buddhism on the peninsula, but looking at the manifold levels of interaction between Korean Buddhism and other regions of Asia, especially China, but also we'll talk a bit also about India at the same time. What I'm going to try to do also is to build upon some of the work that Professor Bronkhorst did in his earlier lectures here at Dongguk, and try to look at Buddhism also from its place within the culture and society of Korea. So this will be a little ambitious, I think, for 10 class meetings, but I'll do the best I can to try to give you a very broad sense of how Korean Buddhism sits within the broader East Asian and, in fact, broader Asian traditions of Buddhism. How many of you went on the Temple Stay program? Okay, the three of you over here, the three musketeers lined up over here, okay? And you all know Temple Stay already, so that's all right. But I thought what I might do also to kind of help maybe enhance a little bit the experience you had is at some point over the next couple of days, I'll do a slideshow about Korean monastic life to give you a sense of what monks are doing in monasteries. You have some sense from the inside now, and this may expand a little bit on what you experienced there. The course is in theory focused on Wonhyo, Wonhyo Desa in the unified Shilla dynasty. But I won't be talking that much about him specifically. I'm going to be using him as sort of a case study for what I think is a broader Korean interest in ways of synthesizing and ultimately bringing together different strands of Buddhism that were being introduced into the Korean peninsula. Because I think Wonhyo's approach is actually indicative of much of the later Korean Buddhist tradition as well. So I'll start with Wonhyo, but use him really as a foil to talk about this broader, more ecumenical focus in Korean Buddhist thought and practice. So rather than on Wonhyo, we're kind of around Wonhyo, reading around Wonhyo, using him as a central focus for talking about broader issues in the development of Korean Buddhist thought and practice. I'll also go from there to discuss ways in which this sort of broader ecumenical focus of Korean Buddhism is highlighted and then carried forward later on during the Goryeo dynasty in Korea in the person of Bojoguksa Chinul-Sunim. So I'll use him as a way of talking about, again, this ecumenical focus, but bringing together the Sun and the Kyo side. Kyo meaning the doctrinal traditions of Buddhism, Sun meaning the meditative traditions of Buddhism. Can you all hear me in the back? So basically, we have 10 lectures. These will be broken down into really 3 or 4 basic components. We'll do something on the early regional influences in the emergence of an indigenous tradition of Korean Buddhism. So the regional forces that are affecting Buddhism on the peninsula and leading to the creation of a uniquely Korean form of Buddhism. We'll then move directly into the philosophy and practice of Wonhyo and related monks like Wisang during the unified Shilla dynasty. And this will lead to an examination of the Kyo strand of Korean Buddhism, looking especially at the emergence of this sort of 화쟁사상 in this ecumenical philosophy in Wonhyo, and the development of some of the philosophical schools of Korean Buddhism, such as the Hwaum school. And then finally, we'll move to the subsequent impact of this ecumenical approach of Wonhyo on Witan and Jinul in the Goryeo dynasty, and move finally then to look at the ways in which this ecumenical philosophy is carried out in practice. And what I'm going to do there is to focus on the emergence of the Kanhwasan technique, the koan technique of Korean Buddhism, in which one uses the catchphrases or the exchanges between master and disciple in the Sun School as a way of catalyzing enlightenment in students. So, in addition to this, we'll have, I'll do one slideshow on Korean Buddhist monastic life, since some of you have already been there. I'll also do a second slideshow, probably a little bit later in the course, on Korean Buddhist travel to China and to India as well. And I have a lecture I'll do around travel, which has several slides of Korean monks who were able to travel overseas then. Well, today I'll do also a little bit of kind of overview about Buddhism to give you sort of some sense of how I view the Buddhist tradition as a sort of foil against which to talk about the developments of Buddhism in Korea. All right, what I want to do first today is go through what I think are a few sets of points about the broader Korean Buddhist tradition that I'd like to make as a way of starting us off in how we think about Korean Buddhism. One of the first things is that when we talk about Korean Buddhism, we really can't treat Korean Buddhism in isolation from the rest of East Asian Buddhism. It's really part and parcel of a broader tradition of Buddhism developing in East Asia, meaning in China, Korea, Japan, and also Vietnam, in fact, which is based upon what we call a Sinophone, based upon classical Chinese, Hanmun. This tradition cuts across current national boundaries and really covers the entirety of the East Asian region. And so when we talk about schools of Buddhism in Korea, invariably, many of these schools will have analogs, will have a similar kind of school in both China and Japan, and later on, often in Vietnam as well. So when we talk about the development of Hwaum in Korea, or Sun in Korea, Hwaum being the flower garland school, the Hwayen school, Sun being the Zen school, as we know it now from the Japanese pronunciation, or the meditation school, these schools are not just Korean schools. These are common East Asian traditions in which Koreans are active participants. And because of this, to try to talk about Korean Buddhism completely in isolation or with complete disregard to developments going on elsewhere in East Asia, I think leads to a lot of misconceptions. And one of the biggest misconceptions is actually that Koreans were only active on the peninsula. In fact, if you look at the early history of Chinese Buddhism, there are many Korean monks who are actually in China, who are active participants in the Chinese Buddhist schools, and who in several cases, several important cases in fact, were leaders of Chinese Buddhist schools. And this is obscured by the fact, in some cases, that these monks used Chinese names. They wrote in Chinese. They clearly were fluent in spoken Chinese as well as Hanmun. They could write Chinese, no problem. And thus they were able to be active participants in the Chinese tradition. This Hwaum or Hwayen school. This means literally, Hwa is a flower, and an or yen is a garland. So this means literally the flower garland school. This is one of the most important of the indigenous schools of East Asian Buddhism. But if you look at the development of the Hwaum school, Hwayen school in China, one of the leaders of the Hwayen school was a Korean monk named Rizang, actually, who we'll talk about later in the course. So when Rizang eventually returns to Korea, where he establishes a Korean branch of Hwayen, which is now called Hwaum in the Korean pronunciation, So he was actually the main successor to one of the early leading figures in the Huayan school, a man named Zhi. So Huizang is his successor. When he leaves China to come back to Korea, he leaves because he hears that the Tang Emperor is planning an invasion of the Korean peninsula, and so he comes back to Korea to warn the Korean king about this impending invasion. When he leaves, who takes over the Huayan school in China but a monk named Fa Zhang, Pupzhang. Pupzhang actually is not Chinese either. He's a third generation descendant of, I believe, Sogdian immigrants into China. So he's not Chinese either. So a lot of the leaders of the Chinese Buddhist schools are monks who come from the periphery of the region, periphery of East Asia, who are themselves not Chinese. But we don't know that they're not Chinese because they use Chinese names, they write in Chinese, they're fully functioning members of Chinese society, but they're actually not of Chinese heritage. It would be like me teaching in Korea in Korean if I could do it. I could be a functioning member of the tradition without actually being Korean, let's say. So this is very typical, actually. In the case of the Sun School, it's almost ubiquitous. Several of the early, let's say one of the earliest leaders of the Sun School is a man named one of the early leaders of the Sun School in China again now is a monk whose name was Kim Hwasang, Kim Hoshang. Hoshang means master. It's upadhyaya. It's a translation of upadhyaya, it's actually more of a transcription of a Khotanese form of upadhyaya, I believe. But Kim, obviously you know, from all the Kims on the roster this morning, is a Korean surname. He's a Korean monk, but he was active in the far reaches of the Chinese Empire in the area of Sichuan region, way out on the southwestern frontier of China at this time. So here we have another case of an important early leader of the Chan or Sun school in China who actually is of Korean heritage. And the fact that they know him mostly by his Korean surname Kim Hwasang rather than his Dharma name suggests that the Chinese were aware that he was actually Korean. Another important case, whom we probably won't talk about too much in the course, but if you know the famous story of Xuanzang, of Hyunjang Popsa, who went to India, came back from India to China, translates hundreds and hundreds of volumes of scripture, especially Abhidharma and Yogacara scripture in China. He had two main disciples, Kuei-ji and a man named Wonchuk. Wonchuk, Yuanzi, is actually Korean. He was probably, in fact, the main successor to Hyunjang Popsa in the Chinese Yogacara school. And his commentary on a text called the Heishinmilgyang, the Sandinilmochana Sutra, written in Chinese, is translated into Tibetan later. This Tibetan translation is used as the basis for the very famous Tibetan reformer in the 14th century, a man named Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa leads the reformation of Tibetan Buddhism that creates the Gelugpa school to which the Dalai Lama today belongs, in fact. So one of the most important figures in Tsongkhapa's revisioning of Tibetan Buddhism actually is a Korean monk who wrote in Chinese, whose work was translated into Tibetan. So you don't have to worry about the names. What I'm trying to suggest here is simply that there's a very vast web of interconnection between Korea and the rest of East Asia, Asia more broadly, in fact, in which Koreans are active participants. And to really understand Korean Buddhism, I think, one has to understand this broad regional influence and perspective on the tradition. So that's the first thing, interconnections between Korean Buddhism and the rest of East Asia. So interconnections between Korean Buddhism and the rest of East Asia then. The second major feature that I'm going to be trying to highlight in the lectures is that Korean Buddhism, for a variety of reasons, I think, very early on became an ecumenical tradition, a synthetic tradition. One way to talk about this notion of an ecumenical tradition is one of the terms that's used is 통불교. This character tong means sort of comprehensive, all-embracing, all-encompassing, and 불교 is the Korean word for Buddhism. So 통불교. So an ecumenical tradition of Buddhism. One of the reasons why I think in Korea you see this very strong tendency toward doctrinal and practice syntheses is that Korea was simply, one reality is that Korea is just geographically a much smaller place than China was. You have this vast expanse of the Chinese mainland, which means that you can have many different strands of regional Buddhism developing, and different schools emphasize in these different locales. We talk about, once again, about Chinese Buddhism as if it were some monolithic tradition. In fact, there are many, many different Chinese Buddhisms. If you go to the south of China, you go to the north of China, you go to the west of China, in all these locales there are very different traditions of Buddhism developing, which often were not in very close interaction with one another. So they develop pretty much independently one from the other, especially in the early period where you have North and South China divided. So for this reason, I think just because of the sheer expanse of the Chinese mainland, China was developed a number of different schools of Buddhism that were not necessarily in interaction one with the other. Korea is much smaller, and its monk population was also much smaller than what we would have found in China at the same time. And this led to an attempt in Korea to try to understand how it was that all of these schools of Buddhism that were developing in East Asia more broadly, how all of them, even though they were so different one from the other, could actually be part of a single coherent tradition. Meaning, you have schools like Sun, Hwalm, Chuntae, all these different schools developing pardon me, in East Asia. Often the doctrinal perspectives of these schools differed, the practice of these schools differed, and the sort of the expectations for practice would differ as well. All of these, however, were Buddhist schools, all of which claimed a pedigree that goes back to the person of the Buddha himself. If that's the case, how could these schools be so different? This problem is compounded by the fact, and we'll talk about this a little later today, that when Buddhism is coming into China from India, Central Asia, from the northwest, the Gandhara region, for example, there are many different strands of Indian Buddhism that are filtering into China as well. And the Chinese are also struggling with this problem of how to reconcile the fact that all these different teachings, Sarvastivada, Yogacara, Madhyamaka, all these different traditions of Buddhism, all claim to be authentically spoken by the Buddha himself. How could the Buddha have spoken so many different kinds of discourses, which seem to be in many cases almost diametrically opposed to one another? And so the Chinese are struggling with the same problem, but the Koreans really get it bad because they have not only the problem of India to deal with, but also the problem of China to deal with. And so I think from very early on, the Koreans are very interested in trying to figure out how to reconcile the apparent differences that they perceive in Buddhism as it's coming. We also have, I think, the reality that in Korea, just because, again, of its geographical location, and as a story that all of you will well know here, Korea was subject to periodic foreign invasion from either Japan, from the Northwest, from China, from virtually every direction except the South, in fact. And because of this, I think there was a lot of pressure on Korean schools to create a central, unified ecclesiastical institution that could pull together the different regional variations of Buddhism in Korea as well into a single overarching system. So I think we'll be returning to this issue a little bit later as well, because this is why there is such interest also in Korean Buddhism on so-called national protection, state protection Buddhism, so-called Han국불교. We'll talk about that later. One other issue about Korean Buddhism more broadly, and this is really not uncommon in the Buddhist tradition, is the attempt to accommodate and adapt elements from the indigenous traditions. So to accommodate and adapt the indigenous traditions of religion, thought, and practice. This actually happens probably as far back as India itself, where Buddhism, as you may know, and as I think Professor Bronkhorst brought out as well, is really part of a broader tradition of religion called the Shramanic tradition of itinerant religious wanderers, of which Buddhism is simply one of a number of different strands. The Jainas are another, the Ajivikas are another. There were like 6 different groups within the Shramanic tradition in India. And there are many features common among these different Shramanic traditions, like the notion of karma, of moral cause and effect, let's say. So I think clearly Buddhism, from almost its inception, was adapting aspects that came out of the indigenous tradition, the indigenous social and cultural milieu in which it was developing. We certainly see this to be the case in China. When Buddhism was coming in, filtering into China, there were already existent in China 2 quite developed and complex religious organizations, religious philosophies. These would be Confucianism and Taoism. Both of these were very strong and already quite well developed in China. So when Buddhism is coming into China from outside, it's having to adapt to the realities of existing religions already being in place. And because of this, I think there is certainly a lot of mutual interaction and mutual influence between indigenous Confucianism and Taoism and imported Buddhism. In the case of Korea, it's a little bit more difficult to ascertain what this accommodation entailed, but I think it clearly is there. And this is because before Buddhism, there really is no organized religion in Korea. Before Buddhism, there really is no written culture in Korea. So Buddhism, when it comes into Korea, is bringing with it not simply Buddhism, but bringing the entirety of Chinese thought and culture as a whole. So Buddhism is the major conduit for the transmission of Chinese culture and thought into the Korean peninsula. And what this means is that those who are writing the first records about what they find when they come to Korea are the Buddhists. And because of this, they typically don't tell us very much about what was actually there already. We do get some hints, though. For example, there's a very famous story in the Samgung Yusa, this memorabilia of the 3 kingdoms, probably one of the most important of the Korean Buddhist histories, which is a very late history, but clearly has incorporated elements that come from much earlier histories as well. This tells the story of, I think it's Wonhyo Desa, when he comes back from China and is trying to establish a Buddhist monastery. He goes to a pond where there is a big yellow dragon that tries to stop him. And through the power of Buddhist incantations, mantra and dharani, he's able to subdue this yellow dragon and convert this dragon to Buddhism. Now, what's going on here clearly, dragons, snakes, are almost invariably in pre-literate agricultural societies autochthonous deities. What I mean by this is that they're deities that are connected to soil and to water. So you have a yellow dragon in this pond. This is an indigenous agricultural deity, which this monk is then subduing through the superior technologies, spiritual technologies of Buddhism, and bringing under the fold then of the Buddhist tradition, under the umbrella of the Buddhist tradition. We have other sort of tantalizing hints as well. For example, there's a Korean monk named Il-je who tries to demonstrate that the progenitor of the Korean race, Hwanin, was actually identical to the Indian king of the gods himself, this Shakra Devanam Indraha, or Indra, and that the offspring of Hwanin and Hwangun, eventually Tangun, who's often seen as the real founder of Korea in a sense, and of the Korean race, himself became an avatar, a manifestation of Sri Mahadevi, Kilsang Tan, as well. So this is an attempt to try to demonstrate connections between indigenous divinities and Buddhism. This is often demonstrated, or often purported to be, an accommodation between what we call shamanism and Buddhism. Shamanism, mugyo. This is a word we use to talk about these indigenous cults of possession and access to ancestors, let's say. If you go to a Korean monastery, you'll often find at the back of the monastery a small shrine to the Sanshin, the mountain god. And if you look in that small shrine, you'll see often a portrait or an image of an old man with long hair and a long white beard sitting on top of a tiger, right? Tigers, up until really the modern period, were all over the mountains of Korea and were thought to be the mountain god himself, actually. So he's always riding a tiger because actually that's where the tigers were. The tigers were the mountain gods. So you'll often find a Sanshingak, a mountain god shrine, in the back of Buddhist temples, because their Buddhist temples are almost always based in the mountains. So it was good to propitiate the tigers who were around you in the temple. You'll often find also a so-called Chilsangak, the seven-star shrine as well. This is a divinity, 7 stars. The Chilsang actually refers to the Big Dipper, to Ursa Major, the Great Bear constellation up in the north of the sky. And this was actually a Taoist divinity that is introduced into Korea, adapted by shamanism, and it finds its way back then into Buddhism during the middle of the Korea dynasty. So you'll often find also a Chilsangak in Korean Buddhist monasteries as well. This influence, though, goes both directions. People often talk about the influence of Korean shamanism on Korean Buddhism. I think, in fact, the reality is there is much, much more and much, much deeper influences of Korean Buddhism on shamanism. And part of the reason why this is the case is that there really is no record of shamanism, or no written record of shamanism in Korea until after the Buddhists have come into the peninsula, and really long after Buddhism has essentially become the state religion of Korea. So much of what we know about shamanism is shamanism as it has been adapted and has adapted to the reality of the presence of Buddhism on the peninsula. So if you go to a shamanic shrine, the shrine is called a pupdang. What is a pupdang? A pupdang is a dharma hall. It's the name the Buddhists use for their major temples. Pupdang. You go to pupdang. 가서 공부하죠. So pupdang, it's a place where you do practice, where you do rituals. It's a Buddhist term again, but the shamans didn't have any indigenous term to talk about a shrine, so they simply adopted the Buddhist term for this. Many of the divinities who are invoked during shamanic kuts, these shamanic performance rites, are actually Buddhist divinities, Buddhist deities, whom the shamans have adapted into their pantheon as well. So if you go through the levels of influence, I think you would find much, much deeper influences of Buddhism on indigenous shamanism than the other direction then. And this leads into a fourth general characteristic about Korean Buddhism, which is that Buddhism, for much of its history in Korea, was a virtual state religion. So Buddhism as a state religion. Part of this is because of the reality or the ways in which Buddhism was really introduced into Korea. And we'll talk about a bit more about that in the next lecture. But this almost always was as part of a state-to-state transmission from a Chinese dynasty, Chinese emperor, to a Korean king. And because of this, in most cases, there is an exception which we'll talk about next time, but in most cases, Buddhism really came as a full package to Korea, transmitted by a ruler as part of an interstate relationship between China and a Korean state. From the outset of Buddhism in Korea, in both Goguryeo and Baekje kingdoms, Buddhism was first and foremost a state religion, and it enjoyed the support of the royal crown, and it wielded immense ecclesiastical, political, and economic influence in Korea. Thanks to the support of the royal court, Buddhism was able to spread fairly rapidly across the Korean peninsula. We had some question how profoundly Goguryeo was affected by Buddhism, but certainly Baekje very quickly became primarily a Buddhist state and was able then to help to expand Buddhism beyond the boundaries of Korea into the Japanese islands as well. So the major transmission of Buddhism into Japan came directly from Korea, not from China, up until about the 6th century or so. But when you think about why it was that Koreans accepted Buddhism, certainly Buddhism offered a profound religious philosophy. It offered exotic rituals to the court. It offered the promise of favorable rebirths in the heavens for themselves and for their ancestors. All this is true. But at the same time also, the reality is that very often states accepted Buddhism not because of these profound philosophies and practices, but because they saw in Buddhism an efficient and quite powerful spiritual technology. I'm going to use this term a few times. A spiritual technology, which in their minds would ensure the prosperity of their houses and the safety of their kingdoms. In other words, there was a certain kind of power in Buddhism, a certain kind of power that the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, and the paraphernalia of the tradition, the scriptures, the rituals, the clothing, all of this was part and parcel of a technology that brought real power. And that power was was profound enough and strong enough to be able to provide real safety to the states that accepted the religion. As one example, if you go to Haeinsa today, Haeinsa is one of the big temples, monasteries down in the south of the peninsula around the Daegu area. Haeinsa is certainly best known because it is the site where the wood blocks of the Korya Taejangyang, the Korean Buddhist canon, are stored. And I'll show you some pictures probably tomorrow then about Haeinsa. But if you look at these two gigantic shrines, or repositories actually, that hold the wood blocks of the Buddhist canon, you have to wonder what state would have gone to the time and the expense to undertake such a massive carving project. Why would they have done this? I mean, I've said almost, maybe with a little bit of hyperbole, but I think it's close, for a state like the Korya dynasty to have decided to undertake a carving of the entire Buddhist canon. There are over 80,000 of these wood blocks down there in this shrine. And each wood block is actually 4 pages of text. So, front and back, 2 pages on each side. So this is a massive undertaking to try to carve one of these things. It isn't just writing it out. That would be just writing, 80,000 times 4 is 32,000 pages of text. Just writing that many pages of text would take years to do. But it isn't just writing it. It's after you've written it, you paste it on one of these specially prepared pieces of wood. You then, backwards, you then carve out around those characters the wood so that the characters are exposed, so that you're able then to print off of these wood blocks, and in this way print the entire Buddhist canon. So just writing that many pages would take years, let alone carving, let alone preparing 80,000 wood blocks, carving those 80,000 wood blocks, 4 pages on each one, and then actually printing those wood blocks. So I've joked that this is the equivalent, really, in the Korya dynasty of the U.S. Undertaking a mission to the moon in the 1960s. It took that kind of commitment on the part of the government and that amount of expense and funding to carry forward. It was an immense undertaking. So why would a state put that kind of money into carving the Korya Buddhist canon? It's not because they were reading that canon necessarily. Some were, probably, but probably the vast majority of monks, let alone the courtiers at the court, would never have looked at the pages of this canon. So what was the value in carving this massive Buddhist canon? The value is that those blocks themselves, as the representation, as the written representation of the Dharma itself, and not just part of the Dharma, but the entirety of the Dharma. The entire canon is there. That power, the power vested in the Dharma, will be so immense that it will be able to then protect the state and the population from the terror of foreign invasions, from natural disaster, and serve as a kind of unifying force to bring together the entire country. The reality is, twice the Buddhist canon was carved, the entire Buddhist canon was carved in Korea. The first time it's destroyed in a foreign invasion, and to protect the country from any further invasion, the Korya decided to recarve the canon as well. So in both cases it's done as a protective talisman. As a protective talisman to guard the country from invasion. So in a sense, what the state is doing, it's taking out whatever insurance it can against external threats or from internal instability, and giving enthusiastic and quite munificent support to the Buddhist religion, and encourage its dissemination among the masses as a means of really protecting the country, protecting the state itself. So throughout Korean Buddhist history, many of the most visible accomplishments we're going to find in the tradition were prompted because of the role that Buddhism could play as an agent for protecting the state. And this is what we call national state protection Buddhism. So Hogubulyo, state protection Buddhism. And when I was here in the 1970s, even just to show how deep this continued, if you went to Chogesa at that time, there was a changpan in front of Chogesa that said, 물론 Chogesa 나오는데, it also said 호국 상단. 바로 앞에 써 있었어요. 아직 가지고 있어요? 조계사 가면은 호국 상단 그런 장판 아직 누구 있어요? 아직 있어요? Yeah. Yeah. So this shows that this means the monks' militia for state defense, 호국 상단. That Buddhism was not just the religion, but also it was a protective agent for the state as a whole. And it used to be all the monks would have gone to the military. Even after their military service, they were going to reserve service. 예비군? 아직도 예비군 해야 합니까? I don't know. So, I mean, monks are still actively involved in state protection in some ways, like it or not. So I think this is not too far-fetched to suggest that Buddhism and state protection were really intimately interconnected there, I think. So, these are four very broad...